Hello students, this is Brooks Lamp. I am in charge of the writing program at George Fox, and this is a video I've prepared for you to give you a few tips as you get ready to retake or to revise your timed writing assessment. This video doesn't really address all the issues a student might have on a timed writing assessment. And if there are some specific additional things that I think would be helpful to point out to you, I'll meet with you. I'll invite you to come meet with me. But by watching this video, you'll have a pretty good sense of the basic strategies, and it'll give you a good idea of what you're shooting for in the assessment. But let me start by saying a moment of what the purpose of the assessment is. Why are we doing this? How can this timed writing assessment help you? This assessment's purpose is to identify students who might need some guidance with college writing, need a little development of their writing skills in order to be successful as a college writer. We include transfer students in the assessment because there are now many ways that students bring transfer writing credit, and some of them are better than others. They don't particularly tell us with confidence that students are ready to write for college. So we're proud of this opportunity to make it possible for transfer students to get writing support. Let me just say a thing or two about what the score means or how the assessment is scored. What is being scored is how well you do only on the 3 types of writing that are stated in the directions. The directions ask you to summarize the provided text, to make observations about the text, what the text is doing, and to interpret the text. It's not scored on how sophisticated or accurate your interpretation of the passages. It's not scored on how well your paragraphs are organized. It's not even scored on how grammatically correct or stylistically advanced your writing is. The technical conventions, like how to cite or what a thesis statement should look like, and so on, those are actually quite different in different fields of college study. But at the conceptual level, what the real work that's happening in any piece of writing, what you're looking at, reading, or thinking about, you need to be able to see it, make observations about it, and synthesize those observations into larger observations or interpretations. And that might be called a hypothesis or a conclusion, depending on your field, but it's all comes down to those similar moves or modes of writing. Okay, so let's get started. For review, let's look again at the assessment directions, in particular the 3 main parts of the assessment. The directions state, read the text provided below and write a response of about 350 to 400 words along the following lines. 1. Begin your response with a short paragraph summarizing what the text says. Restate the text in your own words. Keep it short. 2. Then write a few paragraphs describing what the text is doing. What is the main conflict or idea? What words stand out? Which words have strong or interesting connotations? What is the tone or mood? Identify specific words, phrases, or other features of the text to illustrate and explain what you are seeing. 3. In a final paragraph, form an interpretation of the text based on what you've noticed. Based on what the text says and does, what does the text mean? What is the author's purpose? Connect your interpretation to your observations in the preceding paragraphs. Okay, so here's a few things to notice right off the bat about these 3 steps. First of all, they build on each other. They go from small things to big things. Particularly, the second step is going to ask you to point out things on the very smallest level of the text, and then to say things in the final step about the text as a whole. Also notice that the things you're doing in the response are about the passage. They're about the text. They're not asking you to talk about your own life experiences, nor are they asking you to draw on knowledge you bring about the topic already from your background experience or previous education. All you need to talk about, and all you really should talk about, is the text itself. And the final thing to notice is that if you don't understand, or if you don't maintain the distinctiveness of each of these three different steps, it's not going to come out right. It might look like the paragraphs all do the same thing or say the same thing. What if you don't really have a good sense in your mind going in what the differences are between summarizing, what I would call observing in the second step, and interpreting, then they're all going to come out in the wash about the same way, and they won't have a lot of distinction between them. So let's now briefly look at each of these three and make notice what makes them unique and different from the others. So in the first paragraph, you're asked to summarize the passage. So summary is essentially a representative and neutral restatement of a piece of writing, a text. It's not an interpretation, it's not an opinion, and it doesn't ask you to do really any analysis of the piece. You're simply restating what it says in the plainest sense. It asks you to go from the entire thing. You have to take the entire text and crunch it down or condense it in your summary to a much shorter restatement of what it says. So you do have to select what's important, what's representative, and bring it into its main components. If you see interesting, deeper meanings or strategies in the text, you don't want to put that here. Save that for later. Here's a tip. Read the passage, and when you're trying to summarize, it can be really easy to look for key phrases and to want to use those key phrases. But if you've read attentively and you have in your mind, in your short-term memory, what you just read, just look away from the text itself and type out in your what you think it means in its most basic level. If you restate it that way while you're not looking at it, you'll be way more likely to write a natural restatement in your own words. Here's an example. I'm going to show some examples as we go. Here's an example of a student's summary that I think it works pretty well. Here's a good example. The student wrote, in the text A Walk in the Woods, Rediscovering America on the Appalachian Trail, the author, Bryson Bill, speaks of the fear and uncertainty one undergoes while being in the woods. He describes how being surrounded by thousands of trees just makes you feel like you are in the smallest of space. Also, he compares that feeling of how one felt as a child whenever lost within a crowd, and how even though you know the woods has a vast majority of space once in it, you can only sense that space. Bill goes on to further describing the woods as spooky, stating that in such environment, you cannot help but sense that you are being watched and therefore become paranoid of every noise or movement heard or seen while in the woods. Now this student's summary, this example of a student's summary is a little bit on the longer side. I would say that you don't need to go this far. But what I like about this example is that the student makes it clear that she is not interpreting the text, she's just restating what's in the text already in her own words. And you can tell that because if you look at the subjects of most of the sentences, they often start he or by the author's name, Bill. Bill goes on to further describe, or he compares that feeling. And that's a good way to start your sentences in the summary because it's identifying that this is the author's idea, what the author is saying, not what you're saying. Okay, the next part is the middle paragraph or section, the second section. What is the text doing? And I'm just going to call that making observations, or the observations section. The idea of this section is to make very specific observations about the text at the most local or word level even of what's happening in the language and in the structure of the text. Why is the text written this way? That's a good question to think about. What are some words that are important or tricky or have multiple meanings? What's interesting about the way it's structured? Do you see parallels or patterns or problems, contrasts in the text? Are there sudden leaps or gaps? What might be going on in the way it's written? In this section, you want to try to find 2 or describe 2 or 3 different kinds of things along these lines, different observations you see, different things you can say about the text. And they don't need to go together. You can say things that seem unrelated. Wow, the author uses a lot of words about machines. And then secondly, on the other hand, the author has this part here where he or she jumps to a new topic. There's a gap. Why did he jump here? You don't need to know why those observations go together yet. Just make those observations and let them be independent little paragraphs in the middle of your response. Now, having looked over several dozen student assessments this past week, I've noticed a couple of things I want to point out that you can avoid and things to go for in this very important observation section. So one thing to avoid is you're not making evaluative statements about the piece of writing. In other words, we're not interested in whether you think the writing is good or effective or how it really is making the reader respond. Many students use words or phrases like, the way this is written is really, it makes me really visualize it, or this really hits home, or it really makes the reader think. So phrases like that, but those kinds of statements are statements about the effect of the text, which is not really what we're interested in doing. So find things that stand out and are odd, and think about their possible purpose, rather than the effect that it's creating. Another piece of advice is to quote specific words and phrases, but only words or phrases. Keep your quotes very short. If you start quoting more than a sentence at a time, or even whole sentences, your analysis will get swallowed up in those quotes. What you really want to do is get down to the very specific place or word or phrase that you're making your observation about, and identify what you're noticing. Another thing is that a lot of students might be tempted to pull out their English class sort of knowledge here. Yes, you could talk about metaphors and connotations of words and different literary devices like that in this section. Those things can help you, but it's not necessarily it's not necessary to talk in that way or to think in that way to make good observations. All that you really need to do is find a pattern and try to describe it the best you can based on what you're seeing. Think about it like this. If you were a bug and you had 2 antennae sticking off the top of your head that were very sensitive, those antennae are looking around in the text for different patterns or odd things that stand out. And when you see something, maybe a little light goes off. And so you're looking for those things using your antennae, and when you see something, just try to explain or describe what you're seeing and why you think it might be important. It doesn't need any special vocabulary. It's just identifying and reaching for or speculating about purposes for those things. And the last piece of advice for your observation section is that you don't necessarily want to focus on the most important or obvious things about the passage. It's often better to focus really on the most odd or out of place or surprising details. The things that revoked a reaction in you that you paused over. Why? Because something about those things means the fact that you reacted that way means that you don't see yet the immediate purpose for it. So when you're thinking and writing through what the purpose might be, it will lead to more interesting and better understanding of the text. In other words, you don't want to observe things that are obvious and easy for you to explain what they mean, but rather find the things that are not easy or obvious to explain. Sure, there's a little risk there. You might get stuck, or halfway through you might feel like you didn't get anywhere, but actually your analysis, if you do that, will be more interesting. Okay, the observation section, or the middle section of the 3 steps, is the nitty-gritty part of your essay response. It should probably be the longest and the most detailed, for sure. Here's an example from the student essay from the observation section. And notice the specific words and the way the student uses quotes. Now, I could comment about the strengths and weaknesses of this analysis, but it does the main, it follows the main purpose of identifying specific words and patterns and trying to name or explain what they are and how. Okay, and let's now move on to the last of the 3 steps, the final concluding section, where you're doing interpreting, the interpretation section. Let's think about what interpreting means for a second. It's not the same thing, obviously, as restating or summarizing. It has to do something more than restate what the text already says. So one way to think about interpreting is that it explains the purpose of the passage in a direct way. It tries to make explicit things that are only implicit in the passage. It tries to make obvious or clear what is only apparent at first when you read the passage and summarize it. So your interpretation goes further than the text does in explicitly stating a purpose. It needs to do something more than is already there in the text. Now, on the other hand, you can't just make stuff up out of thin air. You have to go further in your interpretation, but that going further has to be plausible. There must be justification for it, and you can't blatantly contradict what you've seen in the text already. So how do you do that? The answer is that your interpretation has to follow from and develop or unify your observations, the thing that you did in the second section. So it can't completely be a new train of thought floating out on its own and looking disconnected. It has to be built on your observations. So try to tie your observations all together in your interpretation. Start your interpretation paragraph by asking, what's the greater purpose for this reading, this text, that would explain some or all of the observations I made? Why did the author do those things? That will get your interpretation started. Try to connect your observations, and that will make it look like the interpretation follows naturally and consistently from the observations you've already described. Here's 2 examples, actually, of different students who wrote conclusions. One student wrote, "Bill's purpose at the end of the day is to alert readers if the wood is something they hope to one day visit or live in, to be prepared for, because within all that peaceful and beautiful scenery of miles and miles of trees, being in the woods itself will not be a walk in the park." And another student wrote this, "I think that the author is trying to create a sense of danger, and with danger comes wonderment. As humans, when we cannot fully understand something, we marvel at it, and wondering how it can be just so." All right, both of these student examples turn away from observation towards interpretation. But the second example does it a little better. And that's because the student in the second example is more clearly reaching beyond what the text says to a possible deeper purpose or ultimate goal that the writer might have had, to create a sense of wonderment, the student says. Okay, and with that overview of the 3 different parts of what you're doing in the assessment, I will now turn it back to you to revise or to retake the assessment. Hopefully these strategies helped you and give you a better sense of what we're looking for in the assessment. If I get to meet you, I will look forward to that. And if not, I look forward to reading your revised or retaken version. Good luck to you. God bless, and happy writing.